Welcome again to our series on Abraham. Today we're talking about Three's Company. Now, maybe some of you are familiar with the old sitcom from the 70s and 80s, Three's Company. Well, today we're talking about the original Three's Company with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. To catch you up on the story, Abraham is an old man and he has no children. And God has made him a promise that in his old age he would have a son and that his son would make him a father to a great nation. Now, this has happened a while ago. That God made this promise some years back, and Abraham and his wife Sarah, we see, are starting to get impatient. Something we learn here is that waiting on God is no easy task. Even though this is an old story, I feel like a lot of us today can relate, because maybe we feel like we're waiting on God to fulfill something in our lives. See, for Abraham and for Sarah, they were 85 and 75. They were way older than any reasonable expectation to be having kids. And to compound on that, back in that day, it was considered a curse. It was very shameful. And so you can see why they have a lot of anxiety and hopelessness wrapped up in this situation. God made them a promise years ago, and they still haven't seen it happen yet. So their situation is really understandable, but what they choose to do from there is to take matters into their own hands. And we see that deciding to be your own deliverer is a dangerous game. At this point in the story, Sarah is done with waiting, and she decides to hatch her own plan to fulfill God's promise. Let's take a look at Genesis 16:2. Sarah said to Abraham, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abraham agreed with Sarah's proposal. So rather than continuing to wait, Sarah proposes to Abraham that he sleep with her servant Hagar for the sake of having a child. Now, back in their day, this was actually pretty common, that a childless couple would use a servant as a surrogate for the sake of producing an heir. But we know from the Bible that Abraham shouldn't do this. No matter what the reason is, Abraham shouldn't step outside his marriage and sleep with another woman. But rather than wait for God's timing, they decide to follow through with this plan, and we see that it leaves them morally compromised, and they pay a heavy price for it. See, the next thing in the story that we see is that playing God often leads to broken relationships. Let's take a look at the story from Genesis 16. So Abraham had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abraham, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arm, but now that she is pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Abraham replied, "Look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." Then Sarah treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. What a mess. This is like a reality show or a soap opera or something. Hagar becomes pregnant. She's able to conceive and do the one thing that has caused Sarah so much grief and strife in her life. And we see that Hagar treats her with contempt because of it, and she lords it over her. So Sarah, she goes to Abraham and she says, "How could you follow through on this plan? The very plan that she herself orchestrated." And so she blames him and says that God will judge him. And then Abraham acts like somehow this isn't his problem, like he didn't really have a part to play in this. And instead of actually helping the situation, he basically tells Sarah to go and deal with it herself. She's your servant. You go do it, whatever you want to do with it. And so Sarah ends up treating Hagar so horribly that Hagar, a pregnant woman, decides that she would rather run away and live out in the wilderness on her own. So here's what we learn. Trusting God enough to wait on Him is always the best option. See, at the end of this story, we see God come through. Like He always does, He fulfills His promise. The Lord kept His word and did for Sarah exactly what He had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 25 years after God makes his initial promise to Abraham, we see that Abraham and Sarah finally have a son. This is a moment they've been waiting decades for. Abraham is 100 and Sarah is not far behind at 90. And this was such a joyous occasion for them. In fact, they named their son Isaac, which means laughter. And God continues to fulfill his promises because through Isaac becomes the great nation of Israel. And then through the nation of Israel and through Abraham's lineage, we're given Jesus. And through Jesus, the entire world is blessed. So we see that God has fulfilled every single one of his promises to Abraham. Now, maybe you're in a situation right now where you feel like you're waiting on God. Maybe you're waiting on a spouse. Maybe you're waiting on a job opportunity. Maybe you're waiting on even having a child. There's so many situations where we can be waiting on God, and maybe you're thinking about plan B. Maybe you're thinking about taking things into your own hands, and maybe you already have, and you've experienced some undesirable consequences. I just encourage you that wherever we're at waiting on God, that we can learn from the story of Abraham and Sarah, and we can learn that even when things are tough, we can lean into God and to trust in his plan and in his timing.